uh, for the for inviting me back. I mean, it was an interesting invitation a year ago when I really didn't know much about your organization. I guess you were just getting started, and to have this that opportunity to kind of be the initial speaker, and now a year later to see your tremendous growth of your community is very impressive. So I congratulate you on all of that, and I want to thank you again for inviting me back. I love the connections, globally that I have. I've been able to give some of these lectures, not only to petroleum students in the west of India, where I know many of you are, but also in Kazakhstan and some other different places where this school has connections. But I enjoy it very much. So this is a privilege for me to be able to continue on. And I borrowed your advertising kind of slide to get my slide deck kind of started. Well, one of the things that I wanted to add, and this is a different lecture completely from what I talked to you about a year ago. In a sense, I want to try to bring some realism to all of the kind of interest and hype, if you will, almost at times about data analytics. I consider myself a skeptical evangelist of the digital oil field. I mean, I clearly think that adds tremendous amount of value, and I'm always trying to talk about what it can do for people who kind of dismiss their opportunities. But at the same time, people can get too excited about it. And you need to, we always need to have some reality check and some understanding of what is important. Over the last couple of years, I've seen maybe even too much interest in the techniques, the artificial intelligence, machine learning sort of techniques, and everybody wants to become a programmer, and everybody wants to, essentially, improve their skills in R or whatever programming language that you're working with, or whatever modeling tool you happen to be work with. And I think all of those are great. And I want to encourage some of that, but I want to encourage it that in a way that I'm going to kind of give you a couple of lessons to be careful for. And the whole idea of measure what matters. The company with the most data doesn't win. It's the company who makes the better decisions that wins in this sort of game. That's where you create value, is improved decision making. It's not because you have greater automation, or not because you're measuring so much information. Those are enablers. Those are some of the things that you need to do in order to create the value from all of this investment. But some people just get carried away with the technology and they forget the business case. And I want you to try to give a lesson here to, don't forget what it is you're trying to do, be it safety, be it environmental footprint, be it productivity, be it lowering cost, improving profitability, improving productivity. I mean, those are the things you're after, not how good a programmer you might be. So one of the things that I particularly am interested in is the area of telling a story with data. I'm very interested in the whole idea of visualization techniques. It's easy to build a dashboard. It's not so easy to tell a story from all of these complex data sources, because we're bringing more and more of them together all the time. It's not easy to tell the story through some of the analytical techniques, modeling techniques that we use. And because in a sense, most of it, we build a model. If we are an analyst, a data scientist, domain expert, data management person, we are building a model to predict the future. And we are telling a story, but we're not the decision makers. There's a management team, there's an investment team, there's somebody else. So we have to explain what our work is all about. And we have to convince them of the recommendations that we try to make. So it isn't all just about the automation or the field that has sensors. It isn't about the programming and the modeling. To complete the whole journey, we have to communicate what it is we have found out and our conclusions to a different audience. And have not spent near the time that we have with our data, with our computer models, et cetera. And how do you explain in their terms, in an intuitive way? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about telling a good story with data, and again, measuring what matters through my lecture today. Well, this is kind of an interesting question, because I do read that there's a lot of kind of skepticism of our industry about whether or not it's a high-tech industry. We know that there's a serious mechanical part to our work. When you're drilling a well, you have a very mechanical process where you are grinding up the rock as you're drilling a well. It is a very mechanical process with regard to energy on the production side. And processing side of our business. So, it's easy to see that side, and obviously it's been that way for more than 100 years. So it's easy to see that side of our business. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult to see how much data that we acquire, how much of analytical skills that we have to use to build these models. So some high-tech people look down at us and say, well, you're not really an industry, you're a late adopter, you're not moving along as fast as some other industries are. But I kind of push back on that. I say that my answer to this question is very much yes. We are a high-tech industry. Maybe some of it's behind the scenes. Maybe we haven't told the story about that well enough to young engineers to attract them to come for a career in oil and gas, which I still think, despite renewables, despite the environment, we have there's a whole career for young petroleum engineers in our business. They also need to be good environmental stewards. They also need to be good data analysts. We are adding expectations onto what a petroleum engineer is always needed to know. But this high-tech part of it is critical. Now, one of the things that, we can't do Control-Alt-Delete and shut down our oil field, because there's the safety aspect. We are dealing with a highly volatile, sort of product, like oil and gas. If we don't pay constant attention to safety, we can have catastrophic results. So clearly, we're not just going to try anything because it's new and sounds cool. We have to do things that are safe, and obviously all the time. And that's an aspect that maybe brings some conservatism to our adoption of technology. But it's warranted. It's important as we go through. I love this story that I found the other day about the British Prime Minister in the 1930s and 1940s, Sir Winston Churchill. And there was a story one day, and again, it's not from Churchill's perspective. It's kind of this idea: what is your perspective of the oil and gas industry? You need to understand different people's perspectives. So this story was really a perspective from his wife's view. And here they were out walking one day in London, and a street sweeper, not a job that exists too much anymore, but a street sweeper started up a conversation with Mrs. Churchill. And they asked for a while, and then Churchill, after their conversation, asked his wife, what were they discussing? And she says, well, he was in love with me a long time ago. Well, Churchill, with his, kind of regal bearing and everything, kind of looked at her and smiled and said, you see, if you'd married him, you'd be the wife of a street sweeper today. Well, different perspective. Mrs. Churchill looked at her husband in amazement and replied, but no, darling, if I'd married him, he would be the prime minister today. So it depends on your perspective. And I want to try to, get across the idea that petroleum engineering, oil and gas, geoscience are high-tech industries that really need all of these digital literacy skill sets that everybody is talking about. And we can use these tools, and we can improve our operations to provide a critical and still large aspect of energy for global needs. One of the challenges that we have that maybe other industries don't have, and that be manufacturing or e-commerce or online banking, financial sort of services, et cetera, is that the underlying model that we deal with, i.e. the reservoir, is not a static thing. Unlike manufacturing, where we're trying to use all of the data we can, use automation in order to reach an optimal steady state that won't change. Our reservoir is gonna change regardless of what we do to it. And we have to essentially adapt our understanding based on a very dynamic model that, in a sense, we didn't build the reservoir. We built the manufacturing plant. We didn't build the model. We discovered the model. And we can't go down there and look at it in complete form. We have indirect measurements. We have seismic data. We have well logs. We have all of the pressure temperature information from the petroleum engineering side. But we didn't build the reservoir, and we can't define the reservoir exactly. So there's always a degree of uncertainty. There's always a degree of dynamic change. You know, how much gas is being produced, how much oil is being produced, decline curves, how much water is being produced, what is the reservoir pressure as it declines and changes through the field, what is the response of secondary and tertiary recovery techniques. So this dynamic nature of the life cycle of a reservoir, you know, creates a very challenging situation for us as petroleum engineers and geoscientists, mechanical engineers, physical facility engineers, et cetera, to manage something that is always changing. To optimize the results, certainly, but it is something that, you know, is not a static, well, once I figured it out, it's always going to be that way. It's once I figure it out, tomorrow is different. And that provides a really interesting, I mean, it's a frustrating challenge at times, but is a tremendously interesting problem and valuable problem as you know, as try to solve. But and again, we are building something based on a dynamic model underneath. Well, here's just a couple of points of some of our challenges today. You know, and this is from a Danish company that's very big in automation. And clearly, you know, the problem, as they point out, over the last 15 years or so, with the investment in sensors and control systems, SCADA, DCS, whatever, you know, we have smart equipment that's out in the field, the IoT devices, the cloud computing, all the rest of that. There's no shortage in data anymore. But that data is only meaningful when we have context, metadata in terms of the data science world with regard to that. So we still have a lot of trapped information. There's information that the production people need that's trapped in a drilling model. There's people that the production people need that's trapped in the reservoir model. Or there's people that from the logistics and supply chain side need to be trapped in other systems. So while we are moving towards a multidisciplinary life cycle, holistic sort of model of the digital oil field, we have to deal with some of the siloed barriers of how we manage data. And in order to really kind of unlock the cross-functional collaboration that is needed. All of this doesn't sit in one person's head. This information this brings a team together of all of the disciplines that we have through a common data view of what all is going on. Right now, we have our own individual views. The drillers have their view, the reservoir people have their view, the production people have their view, and those, while that has helped optimize those particular functions over the last 15 years or so, it still hasn't unlocked the big picture, which is what we really needed. We still are reactive. While we want to be proactive and predict the future and optimize the future, we still are trying to do a lot of monitoring and surveillance of, you know, when is a pump going to fail, is the question we had earlier, or, you know, how do we do those things? We are still trapped a little bit in the what happened and why did it happen kind of mode, instead of saying what is going to happen, which is a real next step benefit from all of this stuff. So in doing that, expectations are high. Management has read all of the consultant reports, and they expect a lot of their digital engineers, but, you know, we still aren't quite ready to reach our maximum benefit as we go through these things. So in a sense, I think you could go back when I started in the industry, which is now more than 40 years ago. And there's a lot of places where I didn't have all the data I needed to do my interpretation. That's not true today. It's, you know, we are data rich. But in a lot of ways, because of how we collect and manage that data, we end up being information poor. Data is trapped in its own set of metadata, its own standards. It's trapped in applications that aren't really built for collaboration. We still think, I'll do it on a spreadsheet and put it in an attachment to an email. That is a minimalist form of collaboration and is not the way that a lot of the technologies exist. We still have this idea of creating a model, of static and flexible daily drilling report or weekly production report or annual reservoir sort of forecast. When the minute that we finish that static report, things have changed. So looking at these things from snapshot sort of perspective, again, is only a minimalist view of the richness of some of these dynamic models. And with this, it still takes us a lot of time to build that model and to come up with that conclusion. We need to get a lot more productive, a lot quicker in terms of finding these insights. We can capture data in some cases on every second sample rate sort of basis, but then we have to aggregate them almost up to weekly or monthly, sort of models to be able to figure out what's going on. We're throwing away a lot of that time that we would have to react. Well, if any of you have ever heard any of my presentations before, you probably have seen this slide, because I put this slide together 10 years ago. And it really kind of talked about some of the things I thought were myths and truths about the reality of the oil field. I'm not going to go into this slide, because what I've done for this presentation is I have updated what I think are some of those myths and truths about where we are today. So I'm going to have to get rid of this slide in the future, and I'm going to change it because I think there's a new set of things that we need to take a look at. So really the outline of my presentation, my lecture today is this. I want to talk a little bit about how I think COVID has changed the course of the digital oil field. And a lot of it fits into that first myth that I want to talk about, where essentially digital has destroyed distance. I'm just going to list these things and then go into them, as we go through this. But I think the whole idea of security is now becoming more important, because it's both physical and digital now, as we have seen. I'll talk a little bit about the algorithms that we build, and sometimes they don't do what we want them to do. Telling the good story with data, explainable artificial intelligence, the challenge of data and cultural change, how technology is related to employment, and the future role of the petroleum engineer. And then to comment a little bit on the digital literacy as we go through that. And in a sense, the effort is, it isn't just measuring what you can, it is measuring what matters, that counts, and calculating what is relevant, and modeling what is useful. So here's the first kind of question that in your own head, what is this individual doing? Well, he could be playing some massive virtual video game and being, there's whole competitions these days where you can make money just on how good a video gamer you are. And these top video gamers acquire big followings of people that watch them and try to get tips on how to play Fortnite or how to play some other kind of competitive game. But this individual is not playing a video game. He's actually operating heavy equipment on an iron mine in Western Australia. But the idea of destroying distance, this individual is sitting in an office in Perth, Australia, in southeast Australia, working for a company called Rio Tinto. The mine is at the Pilbara complex, which sits about 1,500 kilometers away in northwest Australia. And that big earth mover, digger, truck, all of those things are autonomous. There aren't human beings sitting in those cabins working that equipment. He is the operator. He is the one that is operating all this stuff. And it goes in, there are automated trains, there are automated trucks, automated equipment, automated drilling equipment, et cetera, as they go through this mine. And it's one of the more dramatic applications within mining. of how autonomous operations can really make a difference, not only in cost, but also in safety and productivity of the mine. Well, I think the oil and gas isn't quite as far as along as this particular company is, but it is aiming at something similar. An awful lot of the jobs that you will see in petroleum engineering in the industry now and going forward are essentially a lot like that individual running that operating equipment. Now, while remote operations is still fairly rare in our industry, it's true if you were a directional driller, you may be in an office in Houston, Texas, getting all of this information from the MWD unit that sits on the in the well that might be hundreds of miles away in West Texas, and you are probably controlling that directional drilling operations. But most of the rest of the time, we're looking at this information from a monitoring, surveillance, catching alarms, seeing if the operations are matching your predictive model. That's a whole kind of an approach called manage by exception. Instead of just the traditional field control system ideas of managing to higher and lower bounds that we have set points, as they're called, we are now trying to measure the actual performance against our predicted performance and optimize from that sort of perspective. And again, that needs the model. And so what happens at the wellhead? Well, this has happened a little bit more on offshore than it has onshore so far. But whether you're in the northwest shelf of Australia, in the North Sea, off the Norwegian coast or the Dutch coast or the UK coast, essentially we are building some new facilities that have been over the last 10 or so years that are normally unmanned, or at least are minimally manned. The amount of people that actually sit and work on this facility are order of magnitude less than they used to be. And so with all of this, we are managing this production with data and only occasionally with human intervention. And so in a sense, oil and gas companies in some places, and I know this is not the majority right now, but in some places are mimicking that mining model in terms of managing with data, and the digital has destroyed the distance. And we can work from wherever we want to, as long as we got that good internet connection. And so our operations are changing, just like mining and other high capital cost sort of investments. Well, I picked up this slide from a management consulting, and it kind of looks at the world of digital, not just oil and gas, but looks at the world of digital before the COVID pandemic. And a lot of people are still asking questions of where do they begin their journey. And they really began instrumenting, putting sensors and building the networks out, the infrastructure, if you will, to match the physical to digital kind of operations. But a lot of them were pilots. A lot of them were still early days strategies. A lot of them people weren't really convinced that it would work, except maybe in certain situations. And it kind of still an experimental sort of phase. And, we were playing with the different enabling technologies as are shown there, artificial intelligence, machine learning being a big one, visualization being a very important one. But since COVID, when we had to very quickly adapt to a different way of operating, where we either worked at home or we just had very minimal number of people come to a decision support center, we've quickly moved to integrate and to build up the skill sets of people in those offices. And now, in a sense, the companies are now asking the question of, do they need to go back to work the same way? And we'll talk a little bit in one of my final slides about how the effect on employment and jobs and the rest of it. But I was asked a question of how has COVID changed all of this? The answer is it's accelerated it. It has made us more comfortable that we can operate this way. Some companies have to make a greater investment in the communications and the connectivity that they had, but we're now kind of moved a long way over that maturity curve. because we found out that we actually can do it. And, we don't need to put all those people in that big room in the downtown city office, because they could sit at home with the right connections and the right sort of equipment. And they can do most of their jobs, maybe not all of it, but they can do most of their jobs that way. So COVID has been an accelerator to all of these digital trends. It hasn't stopped it. It's made us go faster. Well, my next point is, the good news is we are connected, and the bad news is we are connected, and some bad guys can figure out ways to get into our systems. We've not done a good enough job of cybersecurity of the work that we have. And the recent example of a hacker, dark side, being able to get into the system pipeline control systems of one of the largest product pipelines in the southern and eastern part of the United States, and through a malware, a ransomware malware contamination of the system, essentially locked up the information on this pipeline, and the operators could no longer safely produce it, had to shut the pipeline down for about 4 or 5 days. Well, there was a lot of economic impact on that, and hundreds of petrol stations essentially ran out of fuel as the distribution was stopped for just a short period of time. Any longer than that, it could have been a catastrophe. But in a sense, the Colonial Pipeline operators had to pay the ransom. They paid 4.4 million US dollars to the dark side criminals. Now, some of it actually the good guys recovered when the criminals tried to take the money out of the dark web and their cryptocurrency kind of payments. But essentially, this proves that this system, and probably many other systems that run critical infrastructure, are vulnerable. And the bad guys, they know how to get there. And so that the problem is here is that the good guys have to be right all of the time, the ones that are trying to protect these systems. The bad guys just have to be right once. And that one intrusion can lead to tremendous damage. And it's getting more and more common, unfortunately, that the bad guys can hack into the systems. Now, this isn't new. I mean, ransomware has been around for over 30 years. It's just getting more sophisticated. And the problem now is these hacker kits, these ways of exploiting companies, are becoming standardized. And you don't have to be one of the best hackers in order to have these exploits. You can just pay some money, buy the kit from the dark web, and almost anybody can become a hacker as they attack some of these systems. And there's a lot of times that they fail. Most times they actually fail, but when they find one way to get in, they're in, and obviously an awful lot of damage can be put together. But here, somebody was just starting it with putting it on tainted floppy disk. If you can think, most of you have never even seen a floppy disk. I'm old enough to know that, to have seen them and used them in some of my early computer work. But again, this stuff's not new. It's just getting better. And while the good guys are working hard to continue to protect their systems, the bad guys are working hard to figure out how to defeat the defenses. Well, occasionally the good guys win one, and recently we had some good news, and I wanted to talk about the good news as well as the challenges. And in a big sting, I mean, often the criminals operated on an encrypted phone network system. They were able to use the encryption that comes in a lot of these things to defeat the intelligence and law enforcement agencies in trying to figure out what was going on and what they were saying and what they were planning. Well, the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, set up a huge sting. They set up one of these encrypted networks, pretended like they were a criminal network that could be trusted, and then finally closed the gap and caught, over 800 criminals and all of their work in drugs and in firearms and in other sorts of illegal activities. So, this was a big win for the law enforcement, but far too often they still struggled. just to find out what the bad guys are trying to do. Well, given that whole idea of cybersecurity needs to be a higher degree of emphasis in our work, let's turn to the next truth, I think, that's coming in all of this stuff, is sometimes our algorithms behave badly. Just as and I'm going to explain to you a little bit why. This isn't some malicious criminal programmer who is, intentionally creating an algorithm to do something wrong. That's the security aspect. Now I'm turning over to the areas where we are actually building algorithms to try to do good things, but because of the way we build them, they don't perform the same way that we want them to, and sometimes very serious consequences. And here, even if this in this book, Machine, Platform, and Crowd, by several researchers at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they've kind of discovered some of the biases that can creep into even some of the most common applications we use here, Google search. And the whole idea here is, in a sense, there is a bias more from the statistical term than the psychological definition of that term, that we can unintentionally, build into our algorithms to produce biased results. Now, one of the biggest examples of this sort of bias is in facial recognition software. And while this is kind of widely recognized now, and in a lot of cases, the application of facial recognition is being limited because they recognize this problem. But really, in a sense, what you had is a very innocent view where mostly a lot of Caucasian and East Asian men, young men, who wrote this software in a Silicon Valley, they were trying to build an application for good use, but because their training data set was just pictures of people like them, the algorithm essentially learned, and the idea that people that looked like them were good and people that didn't look like them were not so good. So an awful lot of really serious, kind of applications of women and people of color and all the rest of it, and how they were essentially automatically labeled, classified through this algorithm, became a real serious kind of an issue. And this very promising, interesting new technology, facial recognition software, is now been tainted because of this known bias that's shown. Well, how do you get this? I mean, how do we allow this to happen? Why didn't we recognize this from the start? Well, the whole idea here is going back all the way to the data that you use to build your training data set. And again, we're all familiar with the term of history matching in reservoir management. And so it's the same kind of thing. We take a certain percentage of the data that we have. We use that as a training set to build the algorithm. And with data-driven models, sometimes we have very few physical constraints. So we don't go to all the effort of labeling good and bad, except on a smaller, bit of a data set. And on all of this stuff, we're figuring out that getting the right data set to build a good algorithm is hard to get. The data extraction from that matters. If you don't have a diverse data set, then you will likely get a biased result. So homogeneous teams produce homogeneous data, which produce biased data results. So even in my teaching methods, where we have trouble finding all the data that we need from sources available to students. And so we just build models off the data we can get our hands on. But I insist all of the students do a pretty significant job of data profiling to understand just how random essentially the data sets are. How do they fit a Gaussian curve? What are their, are they biased towards certain sort of results? And the answer is, in most times, almost all the data sets we have are biased. They don't fit the Gaussian distribution. And so they are subject to, some of these failures. And they're almost inescapable, but you need to understand what it is going in. so that you at least appreciate where your model might work and where your model might not work, depending on the data that you set up. So while everyone seems to be very excited about the new modeling algorithm techniques, the new programming languages, et cetera, um, it really needs to have equal attention to the data that you're using on building the model. And so that's my emphasis. You talk to any of my students, that's one of their big takeaways from my classes, because I don't go in there and teach them how to be a better coder. I go in there to try to teach them how to be a more holistic and accurate and honest model builder. And that, I think, is a message that's very important. So some of these things we have to worry about, these algorithms that behave badly, and what it is that we have to recognize that what kind of data sets that they are using. Models aren't always right. And I think we kind of know that. And we tend to selectively kind of emphasize the ones that do produce value. But we've been trying to predict the future for a long, long time. Whether it's the winner of a result of an election, or the performance of a reservoir, or the performance of a pump, in terms of different things. We're trying to understand what's going to happen. And particularly at big events, maybe I'm looking at buying an oil field, or I'm looking at selling an oil field. I want to predict what the next 10 years are going to look like, right? From all the rest of that. Here's a very famous case in the 1940s in the United States. There was a very closely run presidential election right after World War II. And they needed to have an event. The paper needed a publishing result. They needed a headline, and they were going to predict ahead of time. So their model at the time predicted that the wrong person would win. And big headlines on this very major U.S. newspaper. This is a picture of Harry Truman, gleefully showing how the papers and the media got the results wrong, because he was the winner and not his competitor. So models don't always listen to, the reservoir doesn't always listen to our reservoir model. It throws us some surprises at times. And we have to be prepared, because it's dealing with a degree of uncertainty that maybe we can minimize, but we can't get rid of in terms of building our models. This quote I always love is from an English statistician who worked on the early British encryption or de-encryption program in Britain during World War II, that helped break the German military encryption models and help the British in the war. But his quote was, "All models are wrong," and that has to do with uncertainty. That has to do with limited data that we put into the training models. It has to do with maybe inaccurate labeling, classification of some things in our model. But what we really need is to find some of these that are useful. You should never look for a model that will be perfect. They don't exist. And if someone tries to tell you they've got the perfect model that works all the time, it should raise your suspicions immediately. But that doesn't mean throw them all away. That doesn't mean don't do, excuse me, machine learning models on a reservoir or a piece of equipment or some kind of system. Keep working on it, because some of them are going to lead to useful results. Because again, I'm thinking what you get out of this is not the precision, the number to 3 decimal points that they predict will be the ultimate oil recovery of your model within 15 years. That's not going to be right. But those models that are well trained and are physically constrained, and they are built by with domain expertise as well as good programming skills, using trusted data, many of them will be close. And if they're close, they'll be useful in terms of the decision making that you need to do around the model, when to plug and abandon, when to kind of input a secondary recovery technique, a water flood or a steam flood, whatever it is, on the reservoir. Those things, while not precise, are still useful in helping us make better decisions and creating value. So don't think your model will be perfect, because it never will be. Try to go for your model to be useful, to impact the decisions that you're trying to make. Here's just one example of how really good efforts into models produce widely varying results. And this is about climate change and global warming sort of projections. And here are 8 different models by some of the best environmental scientists in the world, from Australia, from Britain, from places in Europe, from places in the United States. And essentially, if you look at it, there's a difference between just a little over 2 degrees warming and almost 5 degrees warming. And the impact on the globe would be very, very different depending on these results. Which one do you use? Which ones do you trust? Which ones do you build global policy that might impact the entire economy of your country or the fate of an industry? Which one do you choose? It's not obvious. And I don't know the answer to which one of these models is right. I think, again, just like our reservoir, the Earth's climate is a very dynamic system with a lot of inputs. So understanding this is not such an easy problem. The implications of it are dramatic, but which model are we really going to base our work on? That's not an easy question. Because one of the things that we get with machine learning and most artificial learning techniques, they are incredibly powerful correlation engines. And you can take data, we can take lots of data, lots of different kinds of data. And essentially these techniques will be able to build models and give you a pretty important correlation result from them. They'll find you an answer. And we usually use the least squared errors techniques of it was called R squared. In statistics, it used to judge how good our model is. Well, you just look at this. Now, if I want to take the data sets and try to correlate the total US crude imports based on per capita consumption of chickens, I get an R squared of 0.9, which is pretty good. Most people would believe that model. But you need to go back and say, is this realistic? Is eating chickens going to lead to importing more oil? Well, no, this is a humorous site to point out some of the absurdities. So this tylervegan.com website is a really good one to get a laugh about some of these things. But there's just a couple more examples of how two things that are totally unrelated. You can produce very good models with very good correlation numbers. So the whole idea of correlation is not causation. We have to go back to our domain expertise. We have to go back to the understanding of the problem we are working on. And then just to relate, because some of these things you just throw out. That's not a meaningful input model that you're trying to use. And this is building a model to take, essentially the drivers killed in collisions with railway trains to model US crude imports. So yes, you can build a model. Yes, it looks pretty good. Is it meaningful? No, it's not. So be aware of this kind of challenge, which is a really significant one. You don't build your model with all the data possible. I mean, in a sense, it's this big data problem is you collect more and more and more and more data, but then the next thing you do through technique called principal component analysis is to reduce all of that data just to the meaningful input components that are truly independent and are truly relevant to the outcome. And so you throw away most of the data you just collected to get down to the meaningful, kind of attributes of building the model. Next theme, and I'm throwing a lot of these at you with pretty quickly here with my time frame, is visualization. Clearly, the whole idea of showing a lot of this data is important. And this tree map sort of technique, which is now a commercial tool, was developed by researchers at the University of Maryland in the United States. It was actually built for displaying stock values, not oil and gas production, but it's been adapted. And if you're a production engineer and you're responsible for 100 wells, just look at this thing of every well is a rectangle. And the big rectangles are scaled to their production impact on the whole field. And the color that's in the model is essentially how well it is performing against your prediction. So big green boxes means things are going good. Big red boxes means some things are going bad. And you can correlate that with a spatial view. Are all the bad wells close together? Does it mean they're maybe related to a water injection well or something? You can rank them and prioritize them. You can begin to work on the big red boxes and let most of the rest of the wells just stay put. Black meaning it's a small, it is pretty much meeting or within an error bar of what your sort of prediction it was expected to be. So a great visualization tool allowing you to look at a lot of data, but the important ones jump to you visually right off the bat so that can focus what you're doing. You're not going to look at every one of these wells on a spreadsheet. You're going to look at the big red boxes and begin your well workover, sort of jobs, right off the bat. So this is almost an immediate prioritization tool that allows you to see all these things. So how you visualize the data is critical. And probably another area like building the data, looking at the data to build your training set, it is one that is not thought of near as much as it should be. A lot of data visualization techniques get to your brain in terms of an emotional impact. And this is, to me, one of the ones that is one of the most striking. Essentially, this is a picture of a British Army regiment in World War I. So it's about the top picture is about 1914 or something like that. The photograph taken against Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. The bottom picture is that same regiment taken in 1918 after the war had ended in Europe and the regiment had come back. Well, very striking. You can see and kind of understand emotionally a very complex picture of the First World War in just a picture like that. And it'll stick with you for a long, long time. Of course, the danger is it can be manipulated. But in a sense, you need to strive for building your visualization of your results to leave a picture that sticks in your management's head for a long, long time till they make the decision, and not be so complicated and confusing that they forget it just when they walk out the door of the meeting that you just had. So a meaningful, correct picture is clearly an important part of storytelling with data. Now, we can't just say, and then a miracle happens. We really have to explain what it is that our model is doing. And that's a challenge with machine learning. Because in a sense, machine learning is that correlation engine, be it artificial neural networks, random forest, surrogate vector machine. I mean, there's a whole set of techniques that we can use to build these correlations, but they aren't built to explain why. And that's kind of one of the challenges, is now going back and explaining how you got that result. This whole technique now is around explainable AI, or XAI, as some people use the technique. This slide actually comes from the U.S. Military Research Agency, DARPA. But it's looking at all the applications that we are now using machine learning for. So behind the scenes, where maybe in our world we've been used to physics-based models, Darcy's law-based models, gas law equations-based models, whatever, real strong physics-based understanding to do a lot of our reservoir modeling. A lot of things are now being changed by machine learning models. And where here they're talking about transportation, security, medicine, finance, legal, military. We could look at things and say, well, it's drilling, it's completion techniques, it's prediction, artificial lift timing, it's reservoir management, it's logistics, it's environmental stewardship. And in a sense, all of these applications of data analytics are more and more driven by machine learning models. But all of these now, you have to they get a result. Now you want to wonder why and what I should do about that. And is it correlation without causation, or are these things? So trying to explain our model results in terms of how it got there. You can't just say, I use 6 hidden layers within my neural net, and here's my nodes, and who cares? The management making decisions aren't going to care about the details of your technique in modeling. They're going to ask the question of why. and what data do you use? So what are the some of the implications of all of this stuff. So explaining your model now has become the next thing. It's not building the model, where that's the cool, sexy stuff that happens right now. But then once you do it, you have to explain why. And that's not so easy. If we look at it, essentially there is a difference between statistics and machine learning. Statistics is about either regression or classification, and it's building these algorithms based on kind of set known mathematical properties. And so you build that. But artificial intelligence is a collection of these algorithms that are working together to try to emulate human thinking. So, the whole idea of artificial intelligence is a machine model that emulates the human brain, including our ability to learn. So it isn't just one time trained. It's now continue to learn and improve the model from new inputs as we go through it. So the algorithms form the basis of AI, but AI is really a different beast, and we need to evaluate it in a different kind of way. R squared does a good job on statistics-based sort of solutions, but not so much AI. An algorithm, the good news, it's literal. It only does what you tell it to do. The bad news is it only does what you tell it to do. And essentially it doesn't learn. It's not smart. But AI techniques now, with the continued dynamic learning and feedback loops, et cetera, will continue to evolve and to learn. Is it learning the right things? Or is it learning a bias? Is it moving in the right direction? Or is it moving in a direction that doesn't really help us make good operational or economic or investment sort of decisions? So understanding an algorithm is important, but understanding AI is even more complicated. One of the things that we always have to try to be aware of is information asymmetry. One side of a model always has more knowledge, so therefore more power as you go through these things. If you are the modeler and you're presenting to management, in a sense, you have the power because you've got all of the data behind you. But in your communications, visualization, you have to balance that. So management walks away feeling confident and trust, kind of the recommendation that you're trying to talk about. So again, visualization, if you do the programming and do a bad job at visualization, you'll fail. They won't understand your result or have confidence in your model. Bias here, my definition here is a statistical one, not a psychological one. And it gets back to this idea that it is a problem in data sampling. And we rarely will find a randomly sampled Gaussian distribution, normal distribution of data to build our models from. Almost all of our models will start out with a data set that is not random. Engineers don't do random data sampling. We tend to try to pick a certain set of parameters and make money from the start. If you went and said, I want to do a random drilling program over the new leases you bought, your management will throw you out of the door. They don't want a random sample. They don't want to do this just for the right way to acquire data. They want to make money. So we always have a bias sort of approach, bias towards what we think is the right way of doing it. But that leaves our data biased as well in building our models. We have to try to do something to acknowledge that or correct that going forward. Well, what has changed in the last 5 to 6 years in the digital oil field is the fact that, we now have a lot of smarts, our digital capability at the edge being our oil field, our well. And while digital oil field 1.0, I got this slide from a good friend of mine, Tony Edwards at Step Change Global, who helps companies build a lot of these decision support environments. The first challenge was to bring data from the field to the office so that we could have the domain experts building those models, et cetera. Well, now once we do that, we were worried about we were only able to send about 5% of the data that we had in the field to the office. Now, once we build that model, we can install that model on IoT devices. and smart equipment. And essentially, they will continue to learn and continue to process and even control field operations at the edge. So the whole idea of edge processing, IoT devices, mobility, cloud computing, et cetera, all of the rest of that now have become very relevant technologies to the digital oil field. And again, the AI that I build on high performance computings in the office, I can put on chips and have them run kind of continuously and learn at the edge. Technology, which we over focus on, is not really the problem. George Danner, who's a leading data scientist in the Houston area, the Gulf Coast area, and a lot of different industries, he kind of points it out that, far too many technology related projects fail in our companies. It's not because the technology failed, because we lost sight of what we were trying to do. And then we lost sight of understanding of the data that we really were trying to have. So again, my skeptical evangelism is when I see whole conferences that are dedicated on the next technology. I mean, it's fun, it's interesting, I'll go, but that's not the whole problem. That's not the critical part of the problem. What we're trying to do and what the expectations of analytics are is to go beyond the surveillance and monitoring aspects of what we have and move to the future telling, the what's likely to happen. How can I manage the future in a more optimally way? How can I take my P50 and move it up to the P80 result on a probability sort of distribution? I need to have a better understanding of not only what's going on today, that's yesterday's challenge. I need to figure out what's gonna happen. And in doing that, I really need the expertise of domain knowledge, math and statistics, as well as a better understanding of data. How this technology will impact future jobs is a really critical and interesting topic. Will it compete for my job? Or will it be a partner in my job? The expectations we have today of the modern data scientists are overwhelming almost. The super person that could fill most of these on their CVs, I mean, I think it really exists. And most of the companies that I've seen that have implemented it has implemented all of these skill sets and expectations in a team perspective, not just hiring one super data scientist as you go forward in terms of that. Very few of these people exist. But when we have that, we begin to build this partnership where AI is not just a collection of algorithms or a tool. It is actually a coworker in a sense. And we're through natural language processing, we can even interface with these models by talking to them. That's little science fiction-y, but it kind of nearly exists today. And the field, the office, the production, the data, all the rest of these things now work in tandem and kind of work as a collaboration kind of model. So is AI replace jobs? The answer is no. But AI changes jobs and automation changes manual tasks. And that's the future of the work in the digital oil field, is incorporating these new skills. True artificial intelligence doesn't exist, according to Saeed Mubarak, a friend of mine from Saudi Aramco, who writes an awful lot about this and is chair of the digital energy technical section at the SPE. These tools are fantastic. They can do things our brain cannot do, but we can't just let them alone. I mean, the move from automation to autonomy is a very dangerous one, and one that has to be taken very carefully in terms of letting the model run the show, because we've got some examples of some kind of bad results, not just science fiction horror movies, but we need to worry about the autonomy of and how far we move with all of these things. So in conclusion, what does the future look like? I'm not sure. I mean, if I knew, I'd probably make a whole lot of more money investing in some stocks, but I don't know. And I think the people that tell you they know you should be skeptical of them. We know we're going to be more data driven. There's going to be more data available. We know that these machine algorithms, automations are going to be a big part of our world moving forward. So the digital literacy skills need to be part of a petroleum engineer or a geoscientist, curriculum. Everybody becomes a programmer in one way or another, or at least in my view, everybody becomes a digital modeler as we go through this. But please don't forget physics. Don't forget the experimental knowledge that we have in the industry. The people that come in and said, data doesn't matter, we can simulate it. The physical domain knowledge doesn't matter, we can create our models anyway. Be suspicious. I don't like those people. I think they have an immature view of what the problems really are. But people are a big part of it. I mean, an awful lot of companies right now are recognizing the technology is not the problem. They can acquire that. It's becoming commercial, or it's becoming open source. And the problem is now finding the people that really need to run the model, build the models, oversee the models, contribute the physics-based constraints to the models. And the kind of challenge we have in the industry right now is many new graduates have these skill sets. They don't have experience, but they have these skill sets. Everybody I know in my classes is already an accomplished programmer at age 21 or 22, right? With regard to most of it, they've kind of learned on their own. The problem is the people with experience don't have that knowledge. The people that have the knowledge don't have the oil field experience. So there's a real kind of important challenge in reskilling mid-career individuals so that they can gain the digital literacy part of their work. And that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of new online certificate programs so people can kind of gain the learning without having to go back to school if they already are, mid-career kind of places. That Colorado School of Mines, among several other universities, has that kind of online certificate program for mid-career individuals who didn't get this when they were going to school. So to conclude, I tried to throw up some flags that you should be aware of and understand with a skeptical eye in either whether the models you're building yourself or the models that people are presenting to you. But I think overall, I'm optimistic. And this quote from the South African Reverend and human rights campaigner Desmond Tutu was, I think, is an appropriate one. I think we need to not be that critical of people. The models, the rest of that, you criticize, but criticize objectively, criticize constructively. Try to work together to build an answer as we move forward. So the future is still bright, but with digital technologies, data, these other analytical techniques, the future is probably going to be different. And that's the challenge and the excitement, I think, for those of you that are just entering the industry. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my lecture.